During the Cold War, the Russians used a term called the correlation of forces. To the Western ear, it sounded ominous, and it was probably meant to be. The correlation of forces, or соотношение сил, referred to a Soviet method to calculate and evaluate world power. It began as a broad-based concept that attempts to capture the sweep of history. Now, the correlation of forces is multidimensional. In the Soviet method, it consisted of military, political, economic, social, moral, and revolutionary factors, as well as intangible factors such as the strength of various international movements. It was, simultaneously, a philosophical construct, a measuring method, and a guide to action. It was this complex notion the Soviets assessed to gauge their progress in the struggle against the democratic capitalist nations of the West for more than 40 years. The Soviets studied the correlation, and they adjusted their behavior so to take advantage of the large impersonal forces at their disposal. Where possible, they also worked simultaneously to tilt those forces in their own favor. It was this strategic approach that allowed the backward economy and society of the Soviet Union to achieve notable successes against the far more wealthy and more advanced economy of the United States. We can find utility in this correlation of forces. It's a powerful concept that captures the environmental factors that impact a conflict situation over a long period. While the term has its origins in a particular era of international rivalry, the correlation of forces accurately describes the chaotic and confusing environmental factors that act upon us constantly, for good or ill. But this does not mean that we are at the mercy of these powerful forces. Not at all. A good sailor is never at the mercy of the sea. A good sailor is friends with the sea and has struck an accommodation. In fact, he understands that the same correlation of forces that buffet others can be at his disposal. A good sailor can adapt his behavior. A good sailor can place himself in the most advantageous position with respect to these forces and his eventual destination. These are impersonal forces, and we can confront them or we can befriend them and turn them to our advantage. Think of the Japanese martial art of Aikido. Aikido is a system of self-defense that relies upon redirecting the force of an attack rather than opposing it head-on. An opponent may attack suddenly, quickly, from any side. Instead of meeting the attack with the force of our own, we use the attacker's energy against him and for our own benefit. We redirect the force rather than oppose it, rather than expending energy to overcome it. In like fashion, the environment in which we dwell pulses with energy, and many forces are at play. This energy and these forces are oblivious to our existence. They are impersonal, objective, and powerful. Cultural forces, economic forces. It's a correlation of forces. They're much like the winds and currents of a mighty ocean, and we are in a sailing vessel. We can consider ourselves sailors, canny and shrewd, or callow and naive. As canny and shrewd sailors on this sea of uncertainty, we can either fight these powerful forces, or we can turn this environmental energy into our own. There are tendencies and patterns in our society and world that affect us for good or ill, and the effect often depends on whether we recognize those patterns and on how we respond to them. These powerful external forces are neither for us nor against us. They are simply what we make of them. In a sense, it's up to us whether our luck is good or bad, whether opportunities elude us, or whether they make themselves available to us. We can influence the correlation of forces around us. We've talked about conducting an environmental scan in earlier lectures. The correlation of forces suggests the possibility of looking at the various external environment scans together as a whole. It offers us a different prism. It's a holistic way of viewing things. It's a method that takes a long-term view. Now, these forces are cultural, political, economic, and technological. But of course, they can encompass other forces as well, forces that may be particular to your own circumstances. The central idea of our response to these factors is to craft a mode of behavior that yields dividends regardless of the environmental curveballs thrown our way. In other words, we contemplate our response in advance. When the unexpected happens, we react in ways that maximize our goals rather than in ways that may be momentarily satisfying but self-destructive in the longer run. Let's now explore how to recognize larger patterns and tendencies in personal lives, in our workspace, in our own society, and in foreign societies, so that we may utilize techniques that put larger cultural forces on our side. Let's look at how to engage in positive patterns of behavior, to ride with the main currents of life, where opportunities multiply and where collateral possibilities make themselves known. I don't know what forces will affect me today, tomorrow, or next year. I do know that I can control my responses to those forces. I study their tendencies, and I take advantage of them by positioning myself, by engaging in behavior that ensures the best chance for a positive outcome, regardless of what my goal might be. And more often than not, I achieve a positive outcome. Now, you've seen folks like this, folks who seem to win in life far more often than fail. It's mysterious because what they do is relatively invisible. To the observer, someone's ability to recognize larger tendencies and to use them to personal profit can appear mysterious. If all of this seems a bit abstract, let's bring it down to earth. We have a name for it. We call it luck. Now, what is luck? Random House offers this definition. It's the force that seems to operate for good or ill in a person's life, as in shaping circumstances, events, or opportunities. Is luck really something that just happens to people? Is it random? Or is it more complex than that? Is what we call good luck and bad luck actually a type of response to the correlation of forces? In other words, we can conceive of the luck we experience as simply the results of our consistent behavior pattern over time, interacting with the environment around us. For instance, if we shape our behavior to ride the correlation of forces, our luck is more likely to be good than bad. And the converse, if we ignore the correlation of forces and try to use force, whether intellectual or brute, we will likely find our luck is bad more often than not. We have research to substantiate this. Writer Max Gunther wrote a classic in 1977, later reprinted in 2010, called The Luck Factor. Over a 20-year period, Gunther evaluated more than 1,000 subjects on the question, what do lucky people do that unlucky people don't do? The results of his work appear in this book, in which he identifies the 5 basic behaviors exhibited by lucky folks. These behaviors are almost non-existent in the unlucky. He gives them provocative names. Here they are. The spiderweb structure is the result of the first type of luck-generating behavior. The luckiest people are those who have formed a great many friendly contacts with other people. Today, we call it networking. Max Gunther put it this way, rather poetically, I think. You cannot know what thunderbolt of good fortune is being prepared for you now by some distant engine of fate. You cannot know what complex interconnection of human relationships will guide the thunderbolt in your direction. But you can know, with certainty, that the probability of your getting hit is directly proportional to the number of people who know your name. How many people know your name? Opportunities will not seek you out in your apartment or in your ranch house in the cul-de-sac. This means that you put yourself into the mainstream of interaction. That is where the opportunities lie. The next behavior is the hunching skill. Gunther tells us that a hunch is a piece of mind stuff that feels something like knowledge, but doesn't feel perfectly trustworthy. A hunch is sometimes called instinct. It's a conclusion that is based on real data, on facts that you've accumulated and have assessed either consciously or unconsciously. The hunch itself arrives unbidden, and it's based on facts that have not quite reached the surface so that you're aware of them. In sum, it's the ability to know something without being quite able to explain how you know it. This ability dwells substantially in the realm of feelings. We should not ignore these unsettling messages that may at times conflict with the surface facts. We should give room for the seeds of a good hunch to grow and to sprout, to bear fruit. Context is a large part of the soil from which hunches grow, and we ought to broaden our own intellectual context. This context provides the backdrop against which new facts are processed. This means pursuing eclectic education. We should cultivate in ourselves a broad-based knowledge to improve the quality of our hunches. The next behavior is the Avoidance fortuna juvat phenomenon. Avoidance fortuna juvat is a Latin phrase which means fortune favors the bold. Gunther notes that it sounds like some Roman general trying to rally unenthusiastic legionnaires for the next day's battle. But more than a cliche, it carries a measure of truth. Research shows that lucky people tend to be bold people. That is, people who act boldly. The most timid men and women tend to be, without fail, the unluckiest. Boldness means acting in ways that can increase luck. Here are 3 rules to play by as newly emboldened people. 1. Be ready to inspect lucky opportunities when they come your way. Know the difference between boldness and rashness. It's easy to talk yourself out of meeting a challenge by calling it rash. 3. Don't insist on having total advanced knowledge of any situation you're about to enter. If you insist on certainty, you paralyze yourself. The next behavior is the ratchet effect. A ratchet is a device that preserves gains. It allows a wheel to turn forward, but prevents it from slipping back. Likewise, where luck is concerned, if the wheel turns the wrong way, lucky people get out. They have the capacity to get out of deteriorating situations quickly. Gunther tells the story of a Swiss banker who explained his fabulous financial success this way. If you are losing a tug-of-war with a tiger, give him the rope before he gets to your arm. You can always buy yourself another rope. The vivid metaphor captures the spirit of prudence and cold calculation necessary to quit at the right moment, to lock the ratchet at the appropriate time. The 5th and final behavior is the Pessimism Paradox, which is guided by 2 laws that interlock with each other. The first law is that of Mr. Murphy. Anything that can go wrong will go wrong. Doesn't mean you expect it to go wrong, no. It means that you have identified and assessed the risks of the worst possible outcome rather than ignored it. The second law is called Mitchell's Law, and it can be loosely stated as life is slippery like a bar of soap, and if you think you have a good grip on it, you're wrong. No life is ever totally under the control of its owner, and lucky people, well, those are people who adapt to this environment of uncertainty. They ready themselves for the opportunities, and they guard themselves against its hazards. Does this mean lucky people are pessimistic? No, of course not. It means that they have a clear-eyed appreciation for the range of outcomes so that they are never surprised by the worst-case result. These 5 behaviors have been found to improve the outcomes in the lives of people who practice them. It's strategic behavior that seeks to tilt the intangibles in favor of us reaching our goals. It's a positioning game, and it looks to the longer term. If we think of the correlation of forces as constituting the environmental terrain, then the 5 behaviors may be seen as a kind of positioning according to principle. It does not guarantee victory, but smart positioning increases the odds of a positive outcome. These principles of behavior, if followed assiduously, greatly enhance the odds of fulfilling our strategic plan. A major part of the correlation of forces consists in the cultural environment. Cultural forces are deep-rooted and greatly affect how people behave. Now, regardless of how people may dress or how they may superficially act in controlled situations, it is their culture that charts the general path of their behavior, both individually and in groups. So what if you could understand those broad cultural tendencies? What if you could get beyond surface stereotypes and gain an appreciation for what motivates the actions of those around you? What if you could predict their behavior more often than not in crucial situations? We have a tool to do just that. It's called The Dimensions of Culture. It was created by Dutch researcher Geert Hofstede in the early 1970s. After decades of use and revalidation, it remains one of our surest guides to understanding and predicting culturally based behavior. It can tell us why things happen the way they do when strong cultural factors are at work. Now, here's why this kind of knowledge is so valuable. If we know the culture scores of a country, it can help us understand derivative aspects of that country, such as its political processes, its social relations, and its economic organization. It can help us understand why people act the way they do, why things work the way they do, and why institutions have a certain structure. In short, knowledge about a culture of a country can inform us as to the types of behavior we can expect to find in people from that country. Not always, but much of the time, it informs us about tendencies and influences, whether they're strong or weak. And in an increasingly globalized world, this type of knowledge is extremely valuable, especially as we guard against judging others according to stereotypes, or even worse, projecting our own cultural expectations onto those from cultures different than our own. Sometimes we project our own characteristics onto folks from other societies. We create a set of expectations based on those same assumptions. Oftentimes, these projections are invisible to us because our own cultural biases are, for the most part, invisible to us. They are embedded in our psyches as unexamined assumptions. By explicitly investigating the cultural bases of institutional activity of a nation, we can filter out mirror imaging, the projection of our own characteristics onto other societies. We avoid inadvertently inserting our own cultural bias in our perspective. It's far more constructive to set aside these cultural biases when we try to make sense of people of other nationalities. Geert Hofstede defines culture as, quote, the collective programming of the mind that distinguishes the member of one group or category of people from another. It is a kind of software of the mind. For Hofstede, culture gives rise to whole systems of values. These are the core elements of culture. The values are not pertinent unless manifested, and the visual manifestations of culture are covered by the terms symbols, heroes, and rituals. These constitute the practices of culture, which are really subject to accurate interpretation only by cultural insiders. Culture provides the interpretive matrix that allows us to decode culturally inspired practices and repertoires. These repertoires of human interaction are parts of daily life we rarely think about. These repertoires make life predictable and social systems possible. Our modes of conducting business or of performing simple tasks can become so routinized and habitual that they become invisible to us. They acquire this mantle of ritual or of custom. For example, take business customs such as the shaking of hands or perfunctory greetings. Such customs are rooted in habit, in necessity, and convenience. While we sometimes think of customs as somehow quaint or ceremonial, they can serve essential functions. But our own customs tend to be invisible to us, or if not invisible, we don't call them customs. Instead, it's just the way we do things around here. Customs are not things we think about consciously, at least not until we're prodded by having them pointed out. They become noticeable only when we must deal with someone who conducts business within the framework of an entirely different cultural paradigm. Hofstede put it this way, quote, it is as though we, or the people of any society, grow up perceiving the world through glasses with distorting lenses. The things, the events, and relationships we assume to be out there are in fact filtered through this perceptual screen. Customs make life predictable, and based on our expectations of human behavior, we daily make such predictions. Our predictions may sometimes not prove true, says Hofstede, but the more accurately we know a person's mental programming and the situation, the more sure our prediction will be. I think you see where this is going. Culture is a tremendous part of that array of forces that comprise the correlation of forces. We want to understand these forces and to direct their power to support our strategic plan. The dimensions of culture makes this possible. Cultural behavior is not random. It is predictable based on identifiable cultural factors that we measure along 4 dimensions: power distance, uncertainty avoidance, individualism, and masculinity. These 4 factors have proven durable for decades in assessing culture's impact in the international business world. They have proved reliable in explaining behavior, otherwise chaotic and confusing behavior. Now, all of this may be interesting in a kind of abstract sense, but it is also quite useful in a practical sense in our pursuit of clear strategic thinking. The Hofstede model has proven resilient in its predictive power over decades. It has application in any area where cultural differences may divide people. The dimensions of culture can be used in politics, in sports, in economics, in sociology, in religion. The model can help us answer the question, are cultural factors at work in my situation that make certain individual and organizational behavior outcomes more likely than others? This is a perfectly reasonable question. Hofstede's model is built on the notion that different nations possess identifiable cultural characteristics that can influence the structure of business firms, their behavior, and how the people behave in those organizations. If we know the predominant cultural traits of a state, then we may be able to chart the general direction of cultural forces at work. Cultural differences can indicate problem areas that may arise if, say, a business attempts to organize itself outside the bounds of what is generally accepted within a culture. Let's look at each of the 4 dimensions of culture to get an idea how to use this tool. Now, there are 4 dimensions of culture differences among nations: power distance, uncertainty avoidance, individualism, masculinity. First, the Power Distance Index measures how human inequality is handled in a culture with regard to prestige, wealth, and power. It conditions the shape and the character of organizations with regard to how hierarchies are structured and staffed, how rigidly the levels of hierarchy are maintained, and the decision-making processes within the hierarchy. Power distance. Power distance captures how individuals in a society perceive authority and how they react to it. A high power distance score means that superiors and subordinates view each other in entrenched roles. There's no hope for upward mobility. An example of a nation with a high power distance score is Russia at 93. A country with a low power distance score is the United States at 40. The Uncertainty Avoidance Index measures a society's sensitivity to the unknown. It captures how people react to unknown situations, and it affects the structure of institutions and the types of operational repertoires developed to conduct transactions. It is the extent to which people feel threatened by uncertain or unknown situations. Generally speaking, the higher this uncertainty avoidance score, the more rule-driven a society is, with repertoires and standard operating procedures in organizations and institutions clearly spelled out. Greece has one of the highest scores at 112, while the United Kingdom has a score of only 35. The Individualism Index. This index captures how the concept of the individual is handled in society. It affects how people live and work together, in what kinds of relationships, and in what kinds of institutions. The polar opposite of individualism is collectivism. The index measures the degree of individualism or of collectivism in a society. Among other things, this score indicates whether people are motivated more by, say, group rewards or by individual rewards. A country with a high individualism score is Australia at 90. Guatemala has one of the lowest scores in the world at 6. Finally, aggressive versus nurturing behavior. This cultural dimension captures the proclivity of a society toward one of 2 types of goal-directed behavior: ego goals or social goals. According to Hofstede, these 2 poles can also be thought of as masculinity and femininity, with masculine as assertive, tough, and focused on ego goals of material success. Femininity stands for a society in which social gender roles are supposed to be modest, tender, and concerned with the quality of life. As you might imagine, the gender-based way of framing this particular index has come under fire, and yet the contrast between aggressive ego goals and nurturing social goals remains durable. A country with a high ego goals score is Slovakia at 110. One of the highest scoring cultures in the world for social goals is Sweden at 5. No single dimension has a deciding impact on individual behavior or on group organization. These dimensions indicate tendencies in societies and the strength of those tendencies relative to other societies. These 4 dimensions work in tandem in various combinations to yield several different patterns of expectations with regard to culturally based behavior. I think you can see the connection to the correlation of forces. Suddenly, a great deal of what seemed inexplicable is now much clearer than it was. It takes no great leap of faith to understand how a Slovak and a Swede might react differently to the same set of facts. This factor of culture has traditionally been given meager consideration in the business world. Business dispenses with culture because it's difficult to define, it's difficult to quantify, it's difficult to assess how it impacts the bottom line. Chief executive officers who are numbers-oriented are slow to get their minds around the factor of culture because it doesn't show up on the balance sheet. Few people outside of business and psychology are even aware of the power embedded within the dimensions of culture. As such, this presents the opportunistic among us with a chance to seize significant competitive advantage. For if we gain more understanding of the correlation of forces that toss us about, we are better armed to steer a clear course through to achieve our strategic goals. The correlation of forces is a phrase from an earlier time, but it captures the combination of external forces that seem to buffet us without rhyme or reason. Some of these forces are intangible, and others we overlook. While we can rarely affect this correlation of forces directly, we can certainly recognize its main currents, and we can adjust our personal actions in ways to ride those currents to our own benefit. How we deal with those forces can mean the difference between failure and success. We increase our chances of receiving what is usually called good luck. The correlation of forces is a holistic view that combines information from our environmental scan with information from the dimensions of culture. The correlation of forces, the notion of luck, and the dimensions of culture, these are 3 powerful concepts that you can harness to your needs right this second. They give you potent analytical power and dramatically increase your chances of achieving strategic success.